Hello there and welcome. My name is Adam and I am the creator of Mind Map Renovations, an innovative framework to help you live with intention, collaborate with your mind, and unlock that great potential. Today, I'd like to chat with you a little bit about interrupting negative default mode behaviors. Let's start with what default mode behaviors are. Now, if you've been watching any of my other videos, you definitely know by now that the subconscious processes far more data than our conscious mind does. Around 11 million bits of data per second on the subconscious side and 40 to 50 bits per second on the conscious side. Why that's important when we talk about default mode behaviors is because your subconscious stores a lot of information that you live your day-to-day life off of, whether you know it or not. So when we understand that there are systems in place and subroutines that are running in everyday situations, that is the first step to learning how to change our default mode behavior, particularly the negative default mode behaviors that might self-sabotage us from time to time. That is what we're going to be focusing on for this episode. A default mode behavior occurs when an external trigger or event prompts your subconscious mind to do an inventory check. Do I have any prior experience with this trigger or event? If it finds something, it's probably going to trigger that default mode response, something that it has tied in the past to events or circumstances similar to the one that you're experiencing, and it's not even going to consult your conscious mind. It's just going to do that behavior because your brain is trying to help you out. It's trying to do things fast and efficient. On the other hand, if that trigger is something that your subconscious doesn't have any associations for, it's a brand new experience, at that point, it's going to engage those precious 40 to 50 bits of data per second to ask the conscious mind, what should I do here? I don't have any slides for this. So a default mode behavior is actually pretty common because as we get older, we're exposed to more things, we're not as surprised, and we ingrain these things into our overall behavioral patterns. And so the more we do them, the wider that path gets, and what started as a footpath becomes a road, and that road becomes a highway, and then that highway becomes a super highway the more you do those things. So some everyday examples of default mode behaviors that are pretty harmless, so you come home every day, your shoes probably go in the same place, your keys get put in the same place. That's a default mode behavior. Your brain knows that that's where those things belong. Another default mode behavior might be, I'm cold, so I'm going to get a blanket. Now, you're probably going to do that without even really consciously thinking about it, but just as a example here at the top, instead of getting a blanket, there are other things you could do. You could turn the heat up. You could start the fire in the fireplace. You could get a warm beverage. You could get a sweater instead. So there are other ways to solve that problem, but because you have a preferred or you have a default that you've done over and over again, that's always going to be the preference of the subconscious. It's looking for the easiest connection. Where we can sometimes get into trouble with default mode behaviors is when they turn negative. When we have created some sort of default mode that does not serve us, that sometimes self-sabotages us. And what does that look like? Well, for me, for a really long time, that was anytime politics came up. I would be triggered and I would have a response, and it would be a default, and it would not be necessarily the one that I wanted. So my invitation to you at this time is to question your programming and look for those negative default mode behaviors that you might have in your life. And I've got a list up here on the screen that kind of walks through a little bit about what those might look like. So things like shouting, raising your voice to get your way, resisting compromise, shutting down, overeating. Some of these things can be so automatic in our lives that we don't even realize that we have a choice in the matter. The best method that I have found to address default mode behaviors and give yourself the ability and option to make different choices and update your programming is a model that I call NIC, which stands for Notice, Investigate, and Choose. These are sequential steps that do need to be done in order, but when you put them all together, this is going to be your ability to make the really meaningful changes in your life that will be noticed, especially if you're tackling things that are so negative that other people tend to notice them. So let's start with notice. Like we talked about in our episode about disengaging your autopilot, your subconscious has ways to talk to you. It has ways that it tries to communicate and let you know that something is wrong. And in this case of default mode behaviors, it's probably going to clue you in that you've been triggered in some way or another, and it has begun the process of that default mode behavior. So the first step in this model is to notice that you have been triggered in one way or the other. And there are some telltale signs that you will be able to pick up on if you train your brain to look for them. So some examples of what you can look for. I know this one was true for me, flushing. So a face flush, a blush, if you just get red in the face, that's an indicator that your subconscious is triggered and trying to tell you something. Another one is that you might start talking louder because you want to exert some kind of control. That's the default mode that's been triggered. You want to be influential, and so you talk louder. Or maybe you've become really nervous, so you talk really fast, and you just kind of ramble, and you can't get your thoughts in order. That's a sign that you may have been triggered, and something needs to be investigated, which is the next step. Another indicator might be a racing heart. Your heartbeat just starts to really ratchet up, and that's something that you want to tune into. You may also feel a seriously strong desire to get away, to run away from whatever the situation is that has triggered you. And finally, this one is also definitely true for me, jaw clenching. That could be a trigger. That could be your subconscious trying to tell you that something is in your orbit that it is not liking and is triggering some sort of response out of you. Also, muscle clenching, kind of in the neck and shoulders is where I held mine. But all of these are indicators. There are many more, but the point is to kind of tune in and notice what's different from when you're maybe in a calm and regulated state compared to when you have been triggered. This is the first step, and it's essential because you can't do any of the other steps if you miss this one. The next step is to investigate. Now, a lot of the times, the reason we have a negative default mode behavior is because a belief that we have, which we tend to put our beliefs on a pedestal, we tend to believe that they are correct, has been challenged. So when our beliefs are challenged, we are more likely to have negative responses. And because our subconscious is trying to look out for us and be quick and efficient, those responses may be automatic, especially if that belief is very strong. And typically the stronger the belief, anytime it's challenged, the stronger the response. When investigating your default mode behavior, it's going to be helpful to understand what the trigger was, what the behavior is, what the belief behind that behavior is, and then work on a challenge to that belief or to that assumption that you're making in order to potentially make a different choice. So I'll provide a personal example. I talked a little bit about this from my last episode about control and influence, but there was a time in my life that I would be triggered by somebody ignoring a suggestion that I have or a recommendation. That would just always immediately trigger anger in me. And then the anger would lead to whining because that's how I was trying to get my way. Now, sometimes it worked, and I wasn't super proud of the times that it worked. And it wasn't a very good or lasting change, and it certainly did not endear me to the folks that I was interacting with. So that behavior was backed up by a belief that if I just tried hard enough, I could control all outcomes. And that belief was probably formed, as we've talked about, from the age of 0 to 7, when I could whine and get my way, and I could kind of control a lot about my life in that way. But as you grow and become an adult, that's just not true anymore. My efforts really have zero ability to control things I cannot control, namely anybody but me, right? So what I did is I challenged that belief that I had. I challenged, do I actually have control over anybody but me? And if I don't have control, do I have influence? And if I have influence, what's the best form of influence? And I can tell you, whining is not the best form of influence. So that process of noticing that I was having that behavior, investigating what belief was backing that up, allowed me to build a challenge strong enough to make a different choice. And by making a different choice, I'm rewriting my programming. I'm updating that 0 to 7 understanding of the world. The step of investigation might be the hardest one because typically at this point you've already been triggered. So I would like to share with you some options in order for you to buy yourself some time to think a little bit more about what it is that has triggered you, what belief might be behind your response, so that you can then move on to the next step, which is choose. So each one of these steps I'm going to walk through have one thing in common. Each one of them ground you to the present moment. And the reason that is so effective in this model is because default mode behaviors depend on remembering something that happened in the past, making that association with something that's happening in the present. And what that means is you are disassociated from the present moment and you are living in the past where maybe something bad happened or something uncomfortable happened. So that response that you're having is very powerful because as far as your subconscious is concerned, it's real. It's happening right now. So what you can do, your conscious mind can do, is it can remind your subconscious that you are in the present moment where that present moment is safe and you are not in danger. So how do we do that? There are 4 different ways. I'll start with battle breaths. This is one of my favorite ones. So breathing is actually a really powerful tool that we all have, and you can use it in many different situations, and this one's no different. So battle breaths, I came to learn that this concept was deployed for the Navy SEALs, thus the title battle breaths. Before they were able to graduate SEALs from that program, they had a really hard time understanding why so many people washed out. The instructors knew that what they were asking folks to do was not impossible. It was physically possible, but what happened is people just got so mentally and psychologically overwhelmed with everything that was coming at them, the pace. It was like nothing they'd ever experienced. So they asked the Navy to study this problem, and the Navy doctors came in, they studied the problem, they observed what was going on, and they ultimately came back with a recommendation that before you allowed any of the folks to wash out, to ring that bell, it was mandatory for them to do at least 2 minutes of battle breathing. Battle breathing is a 6-second inhale, a 2-second hold, and a 6-second exhale. And repeat for at least 2 minutes. I like to do it for at least 30 seconds. When I'm experiencing some sort of trigger, it tends to be enough. And what has happened in my progression of breaking default mode behaviors is as soon as I recognize that I'm having a response like clenched teeth or tight neck and shoulders, I actually, before I even think about it, I hear myself breathe in and breathe out. And it's because I have programmed myself to recognize and do that automatically, which grounds me to the present moment and allows me to be more intentional. The reason that breath is so effective in helping us break default mode behaviors is because it floods your body with oxygen, both your muscles and your mind, and it is a literal physiological reset. So anytime your subconscious is trying to talk to you and it's using a physiological experience to do that, breathing is a great way for your conscious mind to step in and say, all right, let's talk. But I want to talk in a very calm, cool, and collected way. So if it's good enough for the Navy SEALs, it is definitely good enough for us. And the next thing that I recommend, that if you need help grounding to the present moment in order to think a little bit more about what it is that has been triggered and what belief is behind that trigger, is a body scan. So if you think about your toes and then your feet and then your ankles and your calves and your knees and your thighs and your hips, all the way up to the top of your head, this is going to break whatever default mode behavior is happening at that time, and you are grounded again to the present moment. The cool thing about a body scan is that your subconscious, which we've talked about, has a lot to do with what's going on with your body. The subconscious is always in touch with your body, so if there's something wrong, it's the one that alerts you. If you cut your finger, or if you've got a tick bite or some other sort of insect bite, it's going to alert you that something's wrong. So you are technically always aware of what's going on with your body, but not consciously aware. So by doing a body scan, we are stepping into that conscious awareness and that more intentional place. So the third thing that you can do if you don't really have time to kind of go internally and think about what your body is doing, you can do a surrounding scan. So you can look and see what's around you, what colors, what shapes, what smells, what feels. All of that external observation will ground you to this very present moment and allow you a little bit more space to think about what that trigger has done to you and why you were triggered. And last but certainly not least, the fourth technique that you can use here to buy yourself some time is self-talk. I personally love self-talk. I've gotten very friendly in the way that I speak to myself, and it's really paid off in situations that are maybe just high anxiety, or I've noticed I've been triggered. I kind of have a little bit of an air traffic controller type personality that kind of kicks in, or like a NASA ground control, like, oh, we've got a problem, but we're going to stay calm, cool, and collected. Someone's going to walk me through that. Sometimes I think to myself, okay, Adam, we're going to focus and figure out what's going to go where, and you get to pick how you respond in this moment, and like, oh, you want to run away, so that means that there's probably something worth staying here for. So all of those things are great options for you. You can mix and match them depending on how big of a problem that you're dealing with or how big of a response you're dealing with. But those are four really great ways to kind of pause, buy yourself some time. I will say there is a lot of value in doing the investigation step, even in retrospect. So say a default mode behavior occurred and you were not able to interrupt it. Later that day, if you just spend some time thinking about, okay, what triggered me? What was my behavior? What belief was behind that behavior? That will allow you to prepare for the next time that trigger happens. So don't get discouraged if you miss the mark or if you miss your opportunity. Just use that as an opportunity for learning. And the option to self-reflect is always there no matter what time that you do it. Because the investigation step is probably the hardest one, here's some more examples that might help you understand how this works. So say that your behavior, your default mode behavior, is retreating. You just immediately want to get away from a situation anytime you feel challenged. Well, the belief behind that might be there's a fear of failing, and if you fail, everything will be ruined. And a challenge that you can put against that is, well, is failing the worst thing that could happen? And what are the negative sides of doing nothing? If you retreat, are you abdicating some of your control or your power or your influence? That process might help you make a different choice in that situation where your default mode is, I'm just going to get the heck out of here. Another example is maybe instead of retreating, maybe you're aggressive. Maybe you engage because you've been triggered, your belief has been challenged, and so you're going to aggressively engage. Maybe the belief behind that is pride, and maybe it's that nobody respects me. And a challenge that you can levy there is, is this really about me? And is external validation required for me to feel good? So that's another challenge that you can put up against that, again, to decide maybe I want to make a different choice. Maybe I don't want to be as aggressive, because if your sense of self is strong, then there's really no reason to have that response. And if your sense of self isn't strong, maybe that's what you should work on. And then you can choose a different default mode behavior in that instance. And finally, another example here might be that your behavior is that you don't speak up. That's your default mode behavior. You have a thought, you want to speak up, but you don't. And maybe the belief behind that default mode behavior is, no one cares what I think, and I don't want to rock the boat. But you could challenge that and say, do I have something of value to add here? Can I communicate this in a way that's both calm and respectful? That kind of challenge might, give you the information or the confidence that you need in order to actually speak up to make a different choice, if you make that choice at the end of the day. So now that we have noticed and we have investigated the default mode behavior, the last and final step here is to choose, make a choice. And I do want to really underline that I'm not advocating that you make a different choice 100% of the time when you're deploying this framework. I'm inviting you to be an active participant in your life from day-to-day situations, particularly when default modes tend to be activated. The point here isn't to make a different choice. The point is to live with intention. That way you decide what it is that you do based on the goals and aspirations that you have for your life. So here's what it looks like. You have a trigger at the very top of the process. Once you've been triggered, the next thing that we need to ask here is whether or not you noticed. Now, as we mentioned before, if you don't notice, you don't even get a chance to interrupt that default behavior. You can maybe notice in retrospect, like we talked about, and you can investigate and understand a little bit more about why that's happening so that you'll be prepared for the next time. But in the process, in that moment, if you don't notice, you can't do anything about it. But if you do notice, that gives you the opportunity to investigate. And if you've already figured out what your triggers are and why you behave a certain way, then this part's easy because you already know, oh, politics came up. This is one of my triggers. How am I going to respond? You now have the ability to make that different choice away from what you normally do. But if you are in the moment and you are triggered and you noticed and you're in the investigation step and you're not quite sure why, that's when you wanted to deploy those grounding moments, put yourself in the present moment and give yourself a little bit more time to think so that you can then make a different choice. So you can choose very much to go get that blanket that you wanted because you were cold, or you can make the choice to make yourself a lovely cup of tea because that is a form of being nice to yourself in addition to solving the problem. You can also say, well, I think I'm valid in this moment. I think my default mode behavior is correct and I'm going to go with that. And that is perfectly acceptable. The point is, again, that you have intentionally made that choice. You are no longer at the mercy of your subconscious behavior, of the way that you've just always done it, right or wrong. So there you have it, your very own personalized framework for how to interrupt negative default mode behaviors. I hope that you're able to take the Nick model and start putting it into practice as soon as you do identify a time where you have been triggered or that you have default mode behaviors at work. And I hope that you find a way to let me know how it goes. I would like to thank you so much for joining me for this topic of interrupting negative default mode behaviors. Until I see you again, I invite you to always be nice to yourself.